Hello, everyone. Welcome to this new California Phenomenology Circle meeting. Today, we are going to have the presentation of Professor Thomas Byrne. Byrne, sorry. He's a research assistant professor. He has a classical training in phenomenology. He has completed his PhD at the Husserl archives at Leuven. His works have been translated into 6 languages, and he has given 16 invited talks on 4 continents. Since 2017, he has published 24 articles in journals such as the European Journal of Philosophy, and currently he's a professor developing the wonderful laboratory for phenomenology research to execute novel qualitative studies that employ phenomenology as a research methodology. So today he's going to present on the phenomenology of ChatGPT. The floor is all yours, and thank you everybody for joining us in this conversation today.
Thomas, you're muted.
Still muted, but maybe you don't want to.
Okay, there we go.
Great.
Okay, so do you see my whole screen or just my
Your
script?
PowerPoints.
Okay, just the PowerPoint now. And also just the PowerPoint or more?
We see the outline at the bottom.
Yeah.
Okay, but you don't see my Word document, no?
Nope.
Okay, excellent. Okay, I'm sorry about that. I'm really excited to be here to present the phenomenology of ChatGPT. This is a really exciting paper and a really interesting application of Husserl's philosophy. I'm also very excited about the developments that have come about since I first wrote this paper. I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff that's happened that I'm excited to talk about. So first, the contents. This essay is going to be divided into 2 sections. So first is a discussion of Husserl's phenomenological semiotics. So I can't see my script that I've written, so I'm gonna just talk and hopefully it will go well. It is going to be focused not on Husserl's 1901 logical investigations, as is commonly the case, but instead on his 1913-14 revisions to the 6th logical investigation. I'm going to be focusing on the passive and active experiences of natural language signs that Husserl outlines. I'm then going to apply Husserl's thought to ChatGPT and to other AI LLMs. I'm going to be discussing how Husserl's account can help inform the way we use these technologies and how they are going to be designed and regulated in the future. Yes, I'm going to be applying Husserl theories and then talking about ethical and regulatory implications. So just to get right into the things themselves, first, I'm going to be talking about Husserl's phenomenological semiotics in the logical investigation, in the revisions to the 6th logical investigation. So I just want to start by asking and addressing the question, what is phenomenological semiotics? Well, most of us are probably phenomenologists. It's probably a bit of a different or strange kind of thing to ask or to talk about phenomenological semiotics, but it's actually just pretty straightforward. It's an application of the phenomenological method. So in the same way that, and specifically application to the study of signs. So in the same way that we as phenomenologists study the relationship between the intentional experience and the intentional object. Phenomenological semiotics is the study of the relationship between my consciousness of the sign and the signified, as well as of the sign and the signified objects themselves. So a pretty straightforward of phenomenology. And then I think this is an important point to note is that, in particular, when studying consciousness, we're studying the subjective achievement of meaning giving. So what we're looking at, or at least what Husserl looks at, is how we ensoul a word with its meaning. And this is a kind of pet theory, but I think a lot of phenomenologists begin, or at least address, language as one of the primary topics, because language serves as a really excellent example of the constitutive role of consciousness, or the meaning role of consciousness, because it's very clear that in signs, we mean more than what we are given, that there is a very clear contribution of consciousness which pushes beyond what's intuitively given to what is not. So I think it's really fascinating that Husserl begins his breakthrough work into phenomenology by studying signs. And I mean, if you look at Heidegger or Levinas, you see that all of them are focused on language in some form or another. And I think that this is really because this is a particularly apt example to demonstrate the power of phenomenology. Also, I think this goes without saying, but phenomenology is executed from a first-person perspective. As phenomenologists, I think we can probably all agree here that phenomenological philosophy is done from a first-person perspective. So with that very simple study of what is phenomenological semiotics complete, I want to address Husserl's phenomenological semiotics from his revisions to the sixth logical investigation, which are found in Husserliana volumes 20-1 and 20-2, edited by Mello. So in particular, Husserl's study that I want to address is his distinction between natural language signs and, I guess, not non-natural language signs, but not language signs, let's say. So language signs and not language signs. So I'm going to discuss one key similarity, which is that they're both passively experienced or passively undergone. And I'm going to also discuss one key difference that Husserl notices between them, which is that language signs are experienced as communication, whereas non-language signs are not experienced as communication. So the similarity between them is that both language signs and other signs are that they're both passively experienced. So passive experience is where the ego is not involved in the experience. And this in particular occurs via association, where one thing or something else are bound to each other by association. In the case of signs, one thing is bound to another. The sign is bound to the signified. This allows for the intuition of the sign to draw up the empty intending of the signified. In this sense, the experience is automatic. So when I see a sign, I don't get to pick and choose which object is the signified. Rather, because of the associative binding, the one immediately calls up the other. So I immediately experience a sign as a sign for its particular signified. I just want to briefly contrast this to active experience, where the ego is involved. I'm going to be talking about active experience a little bit more later, but in this case, for active experience, this doesn't mean volition, so I don't have to be willing something. So for example, anytime I am combining, separating, or distinguishing, I'm already actively involved in the experience. So for Husserl, for example, even perception involves active components, where I apprehend the sensations that are present. So the point is that all experiences involve both a passive and active component. So active experience also needs passive experience to be active upon, let's say. Now, I mean, this is pretty straightforward and pretty simple. The difference is communication. And here's the really kind of significant and surprising point that Husserl makes in the revisions to the logical investigations. He says that heard or read language signs are given as communication. That is, we experience them as communication. Husserl writes, language signs are understood in the sense that their meaning is to be understood as communication, that is, as the meaning of a communicator. Now, this represents a really significant historical shift in Husserl, one that is not appropriately noted. So I just want to briefly talk about what this means for Husserl scholarship and for phenomenology scholarship at large. So in the 1901 logical investigations, Husserl said that language signs can be communicative, expressive signs are communicative, but not essentially so. So he believed that expressive signs could function in a communicative context, but that it was not an essential component of the experience of expressive signs. In fact, he demonstrated little interest in communication. He instead wanted to discuss language as it occurred in soliloquy or when I'm talking to myself. He wanted to discuss language as I use it to discuss, to talk to myself. And in this sense, he believed that it was not communicative. Now, in the 1913-14 revisions, Husserl asserts that language is essentially communicative. This is a really fundamental shift in his theory, where he now takes language as something that essentially involves communication, as something that necessarily requires understanding of communication. So while Husserl will maintain the anteriority and primacy of hearing and reading, or of speaking and writing, he also recognizes that language signs need to have the same meaning when they are heard or read. This is a kind of recognition that there is also an importance to our reception of language, that the reception of language in a communicative context is also necessary for language signs to function as language signs. I can talk about this more in the Q&A, but I just want to highlight that Burnett writes, and this is kind of the insight, Husserl admits that genuine signifying must allow for both recognition and intersubjective communication. So we also require reading and listening, that is intersubjective communication, for signs to function as signs. This entails a priority of passive signifying insofar as every active signifying which has the form of speech or writing presupposes that one already understands the meaningful sign one uses. Coming from Husserl, this is indeed a remarkable claim. This is pretty strong language from Burnett, if you know him. So neither the logical investigations nor most of what has been written about Husserl's philosophy of language ever since has prepared us for what looks like a hermeneutical turn in Husserl's work. Yes, someone has their hand up, but I mean, is it okay if I keep going? But okay, yeah, if you have a question.
Oh, just a short question, like the 1913-14 revision, are you just referring to Ideas 1, or was there some other particular text?
There's another text. So it's manuscripts that Husserl wrote but never published during his life. So they are right now only published in German. For a time, I was supposed to be the translator of them. Unfortunately, my German is not up to snuff enough to be able to translate them, but they are, if you look online, they're Husserliana 20-1 and 20-2. Okay. Yeah, but no, of course. So Husserl doesn't just say that language signs are communicative, but of course he also describes how they are communicative. And he says that there are two elements of signs that reveal them as communicative for us. The first is the demand, which is die Zumutung. And so when Husserl is discussing the demand and the other component, he's discussing the ways that language signs appear to us such that they appear to us as communicative. So when we first experience language, we are talking with another person and we experience the language signs as, we experience our interlocutor as demanding us to understand the meaning of our signs. So it's the case that when someone else speaks to me, when I'm talking to you, you don't just hear me speaking, you also hear me as requesting you or demanding you to hear what I'm saying as language with meaning. This is, I think this is, if you examine your own phenomenological experience while I'm talking, you can experience this yourself pretty straightforwardly. When I speak to you, you hear me, you don't just hear me as like a robot or automaton, you hear me as a subject who is trying to communicate and thus requesting also that you listen to me. You do not perceive me as a noise machine, but as a subject who is articulating ideas, who is someone who's also here in the world with you, trying to talk with you, and asking you to listen to me and not just listen to the sounds, but also to think with me. Importantly, this is passively experienced. So when you are listening to me, you're not actively thinking or actively coming to recognize, oh, this person's asking me to listen to them. You passively experience my request to also think what I am thinking, hear my words, and also think with me. Now, Husserl also says that because of the demand, and I think this is really fascinating, signs also come with a should. So what this means is that the physical sounds or the written scribbles don't just appear to you as something out there, but they also appear as something that you should take as language signs. So both, it's the case that I am requesting that you listen to me and think what I'm saying, and you also experience the signs as something that you should take as language, as communication. Husserl writes, each communicative speech, each piece of writing, and further every kind of speech possesses this should. So I think this is really kind of interesting, and I would probably also say quite accurate description of our experience of language as communicative, both because there is another subject requesting me to understand the meaning of the signs, and because the signs themselves also appear as something I should take as language. Now, the question of this clearly, the should has a kind of normative component, but whether it also has an ethical component, I'm curious about, and I'm honestly not entirely sure what to think about that, but we could discuss that during the Q&A. So this all comes to a head, or this all becomes really fascinating when Husserl talks about language signs in the context when the other is not present. In this case, it seems that there is no other demanding me to understand them, such that I would not take these signs as communication. Yet, Husserl says that even when there's no other subject physically present with me, for example, when I open the pages of a book, I still experience a demand. And why do I experience a demand? It's because there's a trace of the demand left over from the personal demands of others. So because I have throughout my entire life, when talking with others, experienced their demand to understand their signs as meaning, when I read the pages on the text or of the book, or when I listen to a podcast, for example, because I've been passively habituated to experience this demand, I also still experience this demand. I still experience a request to understand what the other is saying to me. There's still this experience where when I'm listening to the podcast or reading the signs on the page, I still experience myself being requested or demanded to understand the scribbles or the sounds as communication. And then because of this, I also experience those signs with a should. I see the signs not only as not only request, when I see the signs, I not only feel the request of the other, but I also experience the should. I also experience the signs as something that I should take as language and as communication. So the key insight here is that language signs, in contrast to other non-linguistic signs, are passively experienced as a means of communication. So we not only get this conclusion, but we also understand all of the technical mechanisms that are part of this experience, or all of the conscious structures that are involved in this experience. Let's say it that way because it's more accurate. So section 2, ChatGPT and Husserl. I'm going to be applying Husserl and then also showing how Husserl's analysis of the structures of consciousness that we experience when reading reveal the dangers of AI and how the implications for regulatory bodies and future design of AI. So ChatGPT also involves passive and active experiences of language when we're reading the text on the page. So when the language signs of ChatGPT appear, not on the page, on the screen, when ChatGPT language signs appear on the screen, Husserl says, okay, I back up. Husserl says that all language signs are experienced as communicative. And in the case of ChatGPT, this is also the case. So when the language signs of ChatGPT appear on the screen, I also feel myself requested to understand them as language and as communication, and I also experience them as something that I should understand as language signs, as meant for communication. This is one of the key insights. So the language signs generated by ChatGPT are experienced as communicative. They possess a demand and a should. I feel myself demanded by another subject to understand them, and I also experience the signs themselves as something I should understand as language and as something I should understand as communication. I feel a normative pressure, maybe an ethical pressure to understand them, to grasp them as language and as communication. Now, and here's the real interesting component, is that in the case of reading ChatGPT's text, I'm also actively involved. So as discussed briefly, when I'm reading, I can actively focus on certain words. I'm actively synthesizing the ideas. I'm actively accepting or rejecting what's being said to me. So there is an active component where, I mean, in all reading, but also in the reading of ChatGPT's language signs, I am being actively involved in the process. I am actively reading, I'm putting the sentences together, I'm actively constructing the state of affairs, I'm actively focused on the words. Shameless plug, I also have an article on attention, which is exciting, and then you should, hopefully, you could pick it up. So here, and now here's the big conclusion of the paper, but we're not done yet. Don't worry, it actually gets much more exciting as well. So there's a conflict, as this fine gentleman is showing us in the image. So when I'm working with ChatGPT, when I am typing prompts and then reading the signs that are generated by it, I experience a conflict. So on the one hand, when I'm working with the AI, I have an active awareness that it is an AI. I know that there's not another person communicating with me. I know that there's not another subject out there generating these or writing and producing these signs for the purpose of sharing their world with me. But yet, and this is the idea, I cannot help but experience these signs as communication. Because I've become passively habituated to understand language signs as communication, because I've become passively habituated to understand language signs as something I'm demanded to understand and as something I should understand as communication, when those signs are presented to me, I passively experience them as communication. So there arises a conflict. There is the conflict between my active awareness that I'm engaging with an AI and my passive awareness that the signs are communication. So I'm actively aware that there's no communication, but yet passively aware that this is communication. So what are we to make of this? And I think a really helpful analogy is the Molezlaya illusion here. It's a very simple illusion, but I think it provides a good example where actively, you know, I mean, you can put your hand on the screen to demonstrate this. Actively, you know that the lines are of equal length. I mean, yeah, you're aware that this is the case, that the lines, despite their appearance, are of equal length. Yet, I mean, and at least in most cases, and certainly in my case, you cannot help but passively experience them as of different lengths. The illusion here is intractable to active knowledge. It's obstinate. You cannot, by your active knowledge, change the way that you passively experience this illusion. This is also, I mean, that's why it's so famous, is because even if you put your hand over the fins and see that they're the same length, when you take it away again, you cannot help but see the lines as of different lengths. So the point here is that ChatGPT is itself experienced as an obstinate illusion. I actively know there's no communicating subject. There's just a machine, there's another thing in the world out there that is just generating these signs, but yet I passively experience the language signs as communication. The active and passive awareness presents the machine as a kind of chimera, where we feel ourselves as approached by a phantom or fooled by a phantom. And in this sense, I think Hamlet is particularly helpful here, where he writes, maybe a devil, when he's talking about the ghost of his father after appearing, maybe a devil, and the devil hath power to assume a pleasing shape, yeah, and perhaps out of my weakness and my melancholy, as he is very potent with such spirits, abuses me to damn me. I think this quote is beautiful and also very pertinent to our situation. And then just so you know, the next lines of the play are the famous, I'll have grounds more relative than this. The play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. So some Shakespeare for you as well today. And then I just want to draw in one last conclusion from Husserl, which is really important, that when I experience language signs and when I experience communication, I experience the other subject as passively as being sincere with me. What does this mean? I assume that the other person, I passively assume that the other person is telling me the truth. I passively assume not only that they're telling me the truth, but that they've done their due diligence before they say anything to me. Maybe this isn't not true anymore, but no, I think this is a structure of consciousness that when I'm talking to another, unless I have grounds, good grounds to believe that they're lying to me, I'm going to assume that they're telling me the truth. And not only this, I believe that this other subject is beholden to the norm of truth. So I believe that they are seeking to reveal the world to me as it really is. They're seeking to reveal the world to me as they experience it. So, I mean, yeah, this is very common. You ask someone for directions, you assume they're not going to lie to you. When you ask someone to tell you about like what happened in class, or a student asks another student what happened in class, you're going to assume that they're being honest. This is a kind of bare assumption of human communication, and one that is really necessary for any communication to occur at all. The point is, this can be easily manipulated. So our assumption that others being sincere with us, yeah, so when taken all together, when the signs of ChatGPT are presented to us, we not only assume that they are meant as communication, we not only experience them as requested to be communication and to be meant by others, nor do we just experience their language signs with the should, something I should grasp as language and as meaningful. I also experience this as something that is being sincere, something that is sincerely generated, something that is meant to be taken as the truth. And this can very easily be manipulated in political and social contexts. For example, if someone were created to create any kind of chatbot, ChatGPT, and set them loose on social media, which is already occurring, people are going to assume they're telling the truth people are going to assume that this is communication generated by another subject to share their world with them. They believe that this other, what they take as this other subject is someone who is telling them the truth. And this has really important political and social implications. But when I wrote this paper, the most famous use of this in the news was not in a political or social context. And I think this is really fascinating, but instead in romantic or sexual context. So this influencer, I'm putting finger quotes up, and model, Corinne Marjorie, used 200 hours or 2,000 hours of her videos. So she took all of these videos, she took the transcripts from these videos, and she inserted it into a some kind of algorithm and came up with a chatbot of herself. So this chatbot talked like her, wrote like her, so that people who were willing to pay $1 a minute could talk to this bot, which talked like Corinne Marjorie. So on the one hand, this is like she told people this was a chatbot. She did not say this is me talking to you. She actively let people know that this is a chatbot. So in one sense, it's the case that these are consenting adults, these are consenting people paying for a service. They're paying for the money to talk to this chatbot. But on the other hand, this does seem predatory on the way we experience the world. So I experience communication as something from a communicating subject, even if I'm actively aware that it's not the case. And I experience it as sincere. I experience it as something that I'm requested to understand by another and as something that is sincere. So this, both in the political realm and here also in the romantic realm, the way that we experience language is exploited or capitalized upon, because we, even if we know, and even as these people who were talking to this bot knew, they were talking to an AI, but yet they could not help but feel a certain kind of intimacy with Corinne Marjorie. So now here's the update. I went back. I wrote this paper a long time ago. Well, at least a version of this paper. And I went back and I looked at the status of what had happened. So yeah, it was more successful than she thought. She is a multimillionaire at the age of 24. The bot did an excellent job. People paid thousands and thousands of dollars to talk to her. And yeah, we're really, I don't say lured in by this experience where they did feel a certain intimacy with her, even though they were not talking to her. And now here's where things get interesting. And I think we could talk about this during the discussion. People shared a lot more about themselves than you would think. So people shared like their deepest, darkest desires with her. They and the bot itself not only accepted this, but encouraged it. The bot really played up and played into the desires of the people who were talking to the bot, and really allowed for really strange conversations to occur. So here's some quotes from some newspapers. So Lee Henriksen, or a quote from a newspaper: digital versions like Corinne AI are designed to make users feel like they are having intimate, confidential conversations. So yeah, it's not, they're not, they don't just make them feel, they really experience intimate, confidential conversations. As a result, people may abandon the public selves they present to the world and reveal their private backstage selves. So Corinne Marjorie also looked at the chat logs and she wrote, "What disturbed me more was not what these people said, but it was what Corinne AI would say back this is really strange. If people wanted to participate in a really dark fantasy with me, yeah, through Corinne AI would play back into that fantasy. And I think this is an also really interesting quote from Corinne Marjorie. A lot of the chat logs I read were so scary that I wouldn't even want to talk about it in real life. Even after this, and this is really fascinating, Corinne Marjorie created another bot of herself, but this time using voice. So she is able now not to just chat with people, but talk with them. So you send her a voice recorded message and she'll send a voice recorded message back in her own voice. So this introduces a host of interesting phenomenological implications, but again, we can talk about that during the discussion. I think it's really interesting. So for the conclusion, and I'm a little bit over time, but I think the example of Corinne Marjorie or Corinne AI demonstrates that Husserl's insights are not somehow anachronistic. They reveal to us what's going on when we're talking with ChatGPT or other bots. They show us how the illusion manifests itself, that even though we may have active awareness that these that ChatGPT or other bots are not people, we cannot help but passively experience the language generated as communication by another subject who is demanding that we understand it, and as sincere. We immediately come to language as something that is being sincerely communicated with us. So it's the case that Husserl reveals this to us, and this can be either intentionally or unintentionally seized upon by future programmers to I don't want to say prey upon, but to exploit the structures of consciousness, to exploit the way that we experience language. And I think that this, in addition to the technical and other kind of computational issues, needs to be incorporated into discussions about regulation and how we understand the future of AI. Because one of the examples I initially put in the paper was that even if somehow like the EU, because America's not going to do it, but if the EU put like a disclaimer on each chatbot saying like you're engaging with a robot or a LLM, even if that were there, you still experience the language as communication. So how could we possibly counter this, or can we counter this? These are questions that I kind of open up with the paper. And I just think in the end, it ultimately demonstrates to us that Husserl's theory really still holds sway today and still needs to be considered in these kind of debates if we are to properly understand the way that AIs are experienced and the ways that they need to be regulated going forward. Thank you so much for your time. There's my website and there's my lab's website. I really appreciate your time. I'm actually surprised I was able to do this without my script. I did not plan to go off the cuff, but I know I did it worked out real well. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. This was great. I mean, and sad at the same time. Thanks. And just one thing, check out his lab. They are doing a fantastic thing. The lab for phenomenological research, right?
Yes.
It's very active, and they are organizing interesting events. Yeah. So
we also had Susie come and talk, which was Professor Ferraro come and talk, which was wonderful.
Thanks. The first question is from Mike.
Hi, yeah, thanks for the good talk. So I guess one of the central premises of your view is the requirement for sincerity, which we take for granted, and then the idea is that because of hallucinations or whatever, the ChatGPT may either not be reliable for that, or it may be deliberately insincere by design of whichever AI, author. But I was wondering, especially these days, insincere speech among humans is so rampant. I was wondering if you wouldn't prefer instead something like capacity for a sincerity, and then deny the ChatGPT that capacity altogether, and then still then have to swallow all the difficulties with talking about capacities and, dispositions and the like. You know what I'm saying? But the fact seems to be, and I think, and so I guess one word for so the counterpart to the widespreadedness, at least in our culture, of deliberate insincere speech is then the widespreadedness, the corresponding widespreadedness of, I guess, what we would call cynicism. So I think it seems like what's also widespread is that we sort of assume that we're not being sincerely spoken to. And that's the cynicism, right? And given those facts, perhaps sincerity is either not as strong a requirement as you suggest, or it's more like the capacity for sincerity, which is necessary, but then you're going to have to swallow all the consequences of talking about dispositions and the like. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for your question. So on the one hand, I agree that particularly in political sphere, things are more insincere than they are sincere. However, we don't assume some kind of insincerity or cynicism unless we're given grounds to do so. So in fact, being sincere is kind of a prerequisite for any kind of communication, because if like I assumed everyone was insincere, or if I had to test everyone, language would either be, or like communication would either be slowed down until I could trust someone, or communication would not be possible at all. So to communicate requires that I am taking the other person as revealing the world to me. And I think, again, things like asking someone for directions, or asking someone where the bathroom is, or talking to someone about your day. So like when I ask my wife how was her day, I assume I have no reason to believe that she would lie to me. But even like talking to, let's say, a stranger on a first date, like you're going to assume, like you're not going to go in thinking, oh, this person's going to be totally lying to me. You may have reasons to think that they will be in some way deceptive about who they are, because that's the way dating culture is these days. But when you're talking to someone at first glance, you're going to take them at their word, because it would be impossible to have any kind of functional communication otherwise. And I don't think this is I think this, I don't know if this is something that we learn, but I think something that's kind of assumed, like the doxa, that we just we take people as people who are trying to tell us what their world is like. And unless we're given good reasons to doubt this, we don't. So in the same way that when I am looking at a perceptual object, I take it to be existing, unless it gives me reasons not to. So unless like it starts to flicker or disappears, in that case, then I have good grounds to doubt it. So I think that it's a very kind of similar kind of acceptance where, unless you have grounds to doubt the sincerity, you don't. So like when you're watching MSNBC, or I mean, obviously on Fox News, you have good grounds to doubt the honesty and sincerity of the people. But unless you're engaged in these kinds of political conversations, or on something where cynicism or insincerity are common, you wouldn't have good reasons to doubt that.
Well, just a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying, and certainly we would like what you're saying to be mostly accurate. But one sort of, I mean, if you go buy a car, let's say, right? I mean, how sincere is the guy selling you the car? But then if you think about like how much such commercial transactions we are involved in the society, it seems like maybe once you leave the house or the confines of a certain kind of setting like this one, maybe sincerity just flies out the window so frequently that it's it's maybe not prudent to assume that to be the case, assume sincerity in communication outside of familiar, Heimlich contexts. But that's just speculation on my part, of course, right? Yeah. But it seems to be a big ask, it seems to me, to require sincerity as a necessary condition of communication.
Mhm. And I would say, I mean, yeah, in the case of the car example, you're given good grounds to believe that they would try to swindle you, because yeah, car dealers have a very bad reputation. But like I don't know, the barista at Starbucks is not going to try to like. I don't assume she's lying to me about the price of the coffee. Um, uh, Yeah, I don't like okay, yeah, so like example, a cab driver in the States, I believe is charging me a fair price, but when I was living in China, I always had to like make sure they turned the meter on so that they didn't charge me a higher price. But again, like I'm given good grounds to assume they're going to try to charge me a higher price because that's a common practice in China. So a
I'm
good
like, you asked the barista, is that oat milk? And she's like, yeah, sure.
No, you would assume that's the case because like you could die if they give you the wrong kind of milk. So this is a ridiculous example that I'm talking about during this kind of event, but I was in Budapest, and like it's many years ago, two very beautiful girls approached me and they asked me like, where's a coffee shop? And I said, oh, I didn't know where it was, but we looked on the map and it was across the street. And they asked me if I wanted to go in. And like, I had good grounds to doubt that this was a normal interaction because usually two beautiful girls would not come up to me and ask to go into a coffee shop with me. That's enough. Later, I learned that this is a common scam that they do in Budapest where they invite a young, unsuspecting tourist in and then they give them a menu. And then later they give them a different menu saying you actually owe like $100 for your cup of tea. But even here, like I initially assumed the sincerity until they asked me to go somewhere and I was like, this doesn't make sense. I don't, this is not something that happens to me. So that's just one example.
Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hi. So thanks for the talk. I'm wondering, so there's a lot of Husserl I don't know, and I was just hoping you could like fill up some of this stuff that I don't know about Husserl semiotics. You started out with this distinction, linguistic versus non-linguistic signs. I thought you said, so the linguistic signs are communicative and non-linguistic signs are never communicative. I wonder what's the definition of communicative and how could that be? Do we really want to say that that's the case? It may be that that's Husserl's distinction that maybe we don't want to hold on to anymore, but I'd love to hear what's the definition of communicative in this context. And there are all sorts of counterexamples we could think of, things in nature that communicate something to me. They're not ordinary language, you know? I can build a sundial that communicates to me what time of day it is. The position of the sun itself can tell me if it's, evening or morning, right? So what's the definition of communicative? Could it be that the relationship to subjectivity is actually baked into these definitions, right? So that once I say, okay, ordinary language is communicative, anything that is communicative points to a subject, then as soon as I see ordinary language, I'm assuming subject, right?
Yeah. So you've asked a very brilliant question, and it's specifically directed to parts of Husserl that I've kind of really smoothed over or just kind of skimmed around. So a good example of Husserl makes three distinctions, actually. So he distinguishes between indicators, signals, and language signs. And both signals, which are not language, and language signs are communicative. So the example Husserl uses for a non-linguistic communicative sign is a storm siren. So there's a fisherman out in the harbor and they hear the siren go off and they know that someone's pushed the button saying that a storm is incoming and that they are then to come back to shore, to the harbor. So in this case, it is the case that there are some non-language signs that are communication. So signals are those kinds of signs. There's also indicators which are not communicative. So smoke. I see smoke and I take this as a sign for fire. But the smoke isn't communication of the fire. And it's specifically, as you said, that for communication to be, so for any kind of sign to be communication, it has to be, or at least we experience it as, created by a subject for the purpose of sharing something with us about the world, or about themselves, let's say. So these can be both language or non-language, but the non-language signs are very specific and have a very specific kind of structure that I didn't discuss here. But yes, the core idea is that when we experience something as communication, or for us to experience something as communication, there needs to be a reference to some kind of subject who is demanding me to understand those signs or requesting that I understand those signs, and those signs as something that I should experience as communication. So your question was right on point with regards to Husserl's distinctions. But if you have a follow-up you want to ask.
Okay, so then the other part of it, the GPT part of it, as you probably know, this is like an improvement of previous versions. And it's effective because it's successful in producing prose at a certain kind of level, right? Whereas these earlier versions, these earlier iterations would somehow break up, right? So the output would not be as fluent, so to speak. And so I wonder if that sort of gradation in the quality of the language shouldn't kind of play into this, because when the system is not producing very fluent response, there's something like communication going on, but I know it's not communication from a subjectivity. It's only when the communication achieves a certain kind of fluency or quality level that I ascribe subjectivity to it. See, I'm trying to criticize this link between the communication and the subject behind the communication, because that's the thing that I'm skeptical about.
So I'm curious. So I mean, I'm not actually sure how to respond, but the first thing that comes to mind is, what if you were talking to, like when I'm writing German, let's say, or when I'm trying to talk to someone on a German in a chat, my language also would be quite poor. So in this case, is it experienced as communication? Yeah, it still is. It's still something that's given, but as communication, but something that is not well put together. And probably in the case of language with the bots, as probably it's the case that as long as it's responding to what you're saying, you probably do take those signs. No, as long as the structure of the meaning doesn't fall apart, it's probably the case that you still experience it as communication, probably bad communication, but yet still communication. I think. I'm not sure if you want to follow up.
Well, I'm just because I've been playing with these things for a while, and actually still with these new versions, for example, I found out that if you start a dialogue with it and then you leave your computer for a while, and then you come back and you try to pick up that conversation, the output becomes gibberish. It just becomes ones and characters and non-sentences. So what's going on there? Suddenly, I try to, for example, I can have a conversation with you, go into the other room, come back, pick up the conversation with you. I ascribe subjectivity to your communication. But with the computer, I start a conversation with it. I go into the other room. I come back. Now, all of a sudden, its responses to me have degraded. Do I still ascribe subjectivity to it at that point? Is it sort of a case that I recognize a previous deception, or?
It would probably, I would think it's the latter, in the same way that, I mean, yeah, I come back to perception because that's a classic phenomenological example, but in the same way that when you're walking around a table and then all of a sudden the table like changes color out of nowhere, or like pops out of existence, you realize that you were being deceived or that there was some kind of incorrect thing about your perception of the world. Probably in this way, you experience it as communication initially, and then when it degrades or falls apart, it's the same way in which a perception falls apart, that there's kind of an explosion and you see that you were wrong in what you took it initially to be. I think that's right.
Okay, thank you.
No, thank you, guys. Susie left because she had to go somewhere. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, so I've got a rather embarrassing example that might tie well into the observations you were just making. And I don't know if I have a big punchline at the end, but I'll just share the example because I think it may illustrate your point. This was a while back when the GPTs were just getting started, so I wasn't really thinking in those terms. And I got this text message from a woman like, sorry, I'm running late. I'll be there at this certain time or something like that. And I just assumed that she had made a mistake in her text number. So I just responded something to the effect of like wrong number and may have included a joke or something. But we started communicating. And it turns out it was I'm using it like assuming as a human, but she represented that she was like a Chinese visitor. And so the language communication was off just enough that it actually mirrored that of speaking with someone in a foreign language where English is not their first language. And it was a similar situation of like, I had my guard up, like, here's this attractive female that I'm communicating with, is there something off? And to this day, I still don't know if that was a real human or not. And I tried giving like non sequitur questions or comments to see how they would respond. And like one time it did go silent. So it didn't quite degrade in quality, but it kind of became non-responsive. And at that point I decided just not to risk it. And so I just kind of deleted everything. But it was almost like sincerity is not as much that I trusted they were telling me the truth. Because even if she was like a lying human, I still would have been okay with the conversation. I just would have put up boundaries. But it was more sincerity that I was dealing with someone with subjectivity in a coherent self. And that's where the level of sincerity was, more so than in the content of the communication.
So a couple points. One, this is a common example. So I've had this happen to me where like twice now where someone will text me, I say wrong number. I'm like, oh, hi, I'm here. And then they'll send me a photo of themselves. I'm like, oh, okay, this is not a real person. And yeah, no, but I think that's the case, is that you begin by assuming sincerity. Like if you get a wrong number, you'll, like if when someone initially communicates with you, if you have no reason to not mistrust them, you're going to assume they're a real person. But then as soon as they do something that would suggest that they're trying to scam you or get money, then immediately you're like, oh, okay, this is a scam for money. And then you recognize that they're being insincere. But I think this is a good response maybe to Mike's question, is that when you get this kind of random text, oh, you're going to assume this is sincere. And it's only until you're given good grounds not to that you then say, okay, now I understand what this is. And now I see this is not something real. So I think it's a really good example, actually, a really helpful example. And did you want to follow up, Eric, or?
No, that's it. And I think just the really interesting part is like part of the intrigue and interest of talking to people in different parts of the world and different cultures is that little bit of disconnect around language. And I actually, because I've traveled enough, I actually find it endearing. But I was sincere in thinking at first that she was from China, not that she was a bot. And I still don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah.
No,
there's yeah, in this case it's difficult because I've also corresponded, like I've also said your wrong number. They said, oh, sorry, and I say, oh, no worries, it's fine. So they would say things that would be normal, but there are other cases where I mean, it's a common joke. In fact, I haven't had this happen to me, but it's a common joke where someone will message you like on Facebook, and then the person will write back nonsense, like potato, potato, whatever, and then they'll send another message saying, "Oh, I'm alone right now. Come and see me." And then you just write nonsense back, and then they'll send something else, and then the person will just send me the link, and then they send the link to some kind of scam website, if that makes sense. But it's essentially the case that there's such a like the response is so to your statements is so radically just like unrelated that you realize it's a scam and that it's not a person on the other end of the line. So any other questions? Bishma, you have a question?
No, not right now.
Okay, Bishma is one of my students, one of the I asked. But okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so let me just ask you to fill up more of the Husserl. You talked about Husserl having some kind of a theory of binding between signifier and signified,
Yes.
how they're passively associated. Can you fill in some of the detail of how that works?
Oh gosh.
In other theories of signs and language of signs, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
Of how the signifier and the signified get associated together.
Yeah.
Right. So, and for me, when I hear sign and semiotic, I think of the Saussurean model, for which this is a very big problem. How this sign is actually sort of an abstraction, and what I actually have is a constant flow. And I need to be able to articulate that flow into chunks and then make that chunk correspond to this other chunk to form the unity of a sign is a huge problem in Saussure and Saussurean studies. So I'm wondering what's Husserl's theory behind this connection of signifier and signified? You use this word binding. Maybe you can just pick up that.
So on the one hand, regarding the binding, Husserl, to my knowledge, doesn't have an analysis of this, nor do I understand how that occurs. And I would say that Husserl might initially, oh gosh, yeah, Husserl would initially say that we find, we initially have thoughts and then we put them into words, but the Husserl that I presented today would argue, and I think Heidegger, like him, would say that thoughts are only given in words. That is like, while early Husserl would say, yeah, we can think and then we find the words. I would say more so that the idea that you could have an unclear thought beforehand, I just don't think that exists. I think it's just a poorly articulated thought or a thought that is very vaguely articulated. But I don't think that there's thoughts prior to language. Yeah. And I mean, I think this is why things like the disease that Bruce Willis has, where he loses the capacity to talk, are so scary. Because he's not just losing the capacity to talk, he's losing the capacity to think, I believe. That doesn't really answer your question because Husserl doesn't, and I don't have this kind of theory of associative bonding, but it does answer the part saying that there's this model where there's a flow and then we break it up is just wrong for sure. We first have our thoughts when we speak. So to say I can't find the words means I can't find the thoughts yet. You might have some kind of like single rate, I mean, I'm using Husserl terminology now, but like some lower level kind of experience, but not a thinking experience. So he says, even when, an example would be even when like I'm not really, like when I don't think I'm finding the word, okay, yeah, this is a really complex example. He says that the words are emptily intended, but this is not worth discussing right now because it's so complex that it's very strange theory. But okay, thank you all so much for being here. I'm happy that we talked for so long too. We went overtime. That's great. It was a really enjoyable conversation. No, in particular, I really enjoyed preparing this presentation, especially finding out more about that model who had done the AI bots. I'm still going to think about this and what this means. And $1 a minute, I can't believe she got away with that. But have a good afternoon, and hopefully I'll see many of you at conferences in the near future. Thank you so much.